I never imagined my life could change because of a single text message. But before all of this began, I was just a small-time graphic designer living a monotonous existence in a cramped apartment with my 4-year-old son, Paul, who meant everything to me. Despite his young age, there was something remarkably perceptive in his eyes that always caught me off guard. Perhaps he sensed how lonely I felt, or maybe he was simply intuitive enough to hear what my heart couldn't say aloud. This morning when I left for the office, I had no idea what Paul had done. Last night he'd been playing with my phone, and I assumed he was just absorbed in his usual games. I was wrong. He'd done something else entirely, something that would turn my world upside down. He'd sent a message to the CEO. Yes, the CEO himself. Holden Cross. The man everyone feared, whose reputation for being cold and distant preceded him everywhere he went. His rare smiles felt like winter itself, and my little boy had messaged him with these simple words. Papa's birthday is tomorrow. Please come. I discovered this when Holden summoned me to his office. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood outside his cabin door, trying to steady my breathing before knocking. When I finally entered, Holden was seated in his leather chair, but something was different about his expression today. He was studying me like I was some complicated puzzle he couldn't quite solve. I forced my voice to remain calm as I asked, "Sir, you called for me?" He remained silent for several long seconds, then picked up his phone and turned the screen toward me. There, in Paul's clumsy typing, were those words, "Papa's birthday is tomorrow. Please come." Heat flooded my face and I found myself unable to form words. My tongue felt paralyzed. Holden asked quietly, "Your son sent this?" His voice was soft, yet there was something underneath it, something I couldn't identify. I could only manage a nod before stammering, "I'm terribly sorry, sir. Paul is just a child. He didn't understand what he was doing." Holden set the phone aside and looked directly into my eyes. "Your birthday is tomorrow?" I hesitated, then answered, "Yes. But sir, you don't have any obligation to." He cut me off smoothly. "I'll be there." Those 3 words made my heart stop beating for a moment. Throughout the entire day, I couldn't focus on my work. My mind kept circling back to one question. Would Holden actually come? Really? He was such a busy man, so unreachable and important. He never had time for anyone, let alone for something as trivial as an employee's birthday. Maybe he was just being polite. Or perhaps he'd forget entirely by tomorrow. When I returned home and saw the excitement glowing on Paul's face, I couldn't bring myself to say anything that might dim it. He asked eagerly, "Papa, when will the cake arrive?" I pulled him into a hug, my heart breaking as I said, "Maybe it won't come, sweetheart." But the hope shining in his eyes was almost unbearable to witness. Around midnight, while I was tucking Paul into bed, the doorbell suddenly rang. My heart rate accelerated immediately. Who could possibly be here at this hour? I opened the door and found Holden standing there. He was holding a cake in his hands, and when he spoke "Happy birthday, Hendrix," his voice was trembling. In that instant, everything I thought I knew shifted. I stood frozen in the doorway, trying to process what was happening. Holden Cross, the man who maintained such rigid professional boundaries, was standing at my apartment door past midnight with a birthday cake. The man who never showed vulnerability was speaking to me with a voice that shook with emotion. Nothing about this made sense, yet here he was. "Sir, how did you?" I couldn't even complete my sentence. My brain had short-circuited. Holden stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. And suddenly my modest living room felt even smaller with his commanding presence filling the space. He placed the cake carefully on my coffee table, then slowly turned to face me. "Paul said it was your birthday, so I came." His voice still carried that tremor. I struggled to find appropriate words. This situation felt surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's life. Holden Cross, who never visited anyone's home, who never entered anyone's personal space, was standing in my tiny apartment. I managed to say, "You really didn't need to do this, sir. I understand that Paul must have disturbed you, and I apologize." He smiled, but there was pain woven through that expression. "I didn't need to," he agreed quietly, "but I wanted to." Those words struck something deep inside me. He moved toward my worn sofa and sat down. And whether I wanted to or not, I found myself sitting as well. The silence between us felt heavy, almost suffocating. Then he asked softly, "Where's Paul?" "He's sleeping," I answered. Holden nodded, then looked at the cake. "Then we'll celebrate together, just the two of us." He began lighting the candles, and I watched in stunned silence. When he started singing Happy Birthday just for me in the quiet darkness of my apartment, my throat tightened with unexpected emotion. His voice was so gentle, so sincere, as if he'd never sung this song for anyone before. When he finished, he said, "Make a wish, Hendrix." I closed my eyes and wished for something impossible, that this moment would never end. After cutting the cake, we sat together in silence. Neither of us spoke, neither of us moved, just silence. Finally, I gathered enough courage to ask, "Are you all right, sir?" He laughed, but it was hollow, echoing with hidden pain. "I'm fine. I just didn't want to be alone tonight." Hearing this made something inside me ache. I'd never imagined that someone like Holden could feel pain, could experience loneliness. He looked directly into my eyes and said, "You know, Hendrix, sometimes I think about what my life would be like if I were more like you, a normal life. A small home, a son who calls me Papa. Maybe then I'd be happy." My breath caught in my chest. I asked slowly, "You're not happy?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering, "No, I haven't been happy for a very long time." As he said this, tears welled up in his eyes but didn't fall. They just stayed there, suspended, as if he'd forgotten how to cry. I reached out and placed my hand over his, just a small touch. But with that simple contact, something crumbled between us. Some invisible wall that had separated us suddenly came crashing down, leaving us both exposed and vulnerable in ways neither of us had expected. The next morning when I woke up, Holden was gone. But there was a note left on my table. "Thank you for last night, H." My heart sank reading those words. Had yesterday just been a moment of weakness for him? Was he already back to his cold, distant self, pretending nothing had happened between us? When I arrived at the office, everything felt different yet somehow the same. Holden wasn't speaking to me directly anymore. Only emails, only formal instructions, as if that midnight encounter had been erased from existence. But I knew something had changed because whenever I passed by his cabin, he would look up. And in his eyes, I could see that same pain he'd revealed to me that night. After several days of this torture, I couldn't take it anymore. I gathered my courage and decided to confront him. I knocked on his cabin door and walked in without waiting for permission. He looked shocked to see me enter so boldly. "Hendrix, I'm in the middle of..." "Why?" I interrupted him with that single word. "Why aren't you talking to me? Why have you gone back to being the person you were before?" He fell silent. Then he stood up from his chair and walked toward me. "Because I'm scared," he admitted. All my anger evaporated instantly. "Scared of what?" I asked gently. He came so close that I could feel his breath on my face. "Of you," he whispered. "I'm terrified of you, Hendrix." I didn't know how to respond to that confession. Before I could say anything, he continued, "Do you understand what you've done to me? You've made me feel things I thought I'd buried forever. You've made me want things I have no right to want." His raw honesty left me speechless. "What do you want?" I finally managed to ask. He looked away, his jaw clenched. "I want to walk away from all of this, the expectations, the responsibilities, the endless pressure. I want to come home to someone who looks at me the way Paul looks at you. I want to be someone's entire world instead of just a title on a business card." The weeks that followed were strange. Holden and I moved around each other carefully, like two people learning a new dance. We didn't discuss what had happened or what he'd revealed, but there was an unspoken understanding between us now. Brief glances across the office floor, a slight smile when we passed each other in the hallway. Small gestures that spoke volumes about what we were both trying to navigate. Then everything changed when Paul got sick. It happened suddenly, a fever that spiked so high I panicked. I rushed home from work and immediately took him to the hospital. Sitting in that sterile waiting room, alone and frightened, I'd never felt more helpless. That's when Holden appeared. He didn't call first, didn't ask permission. He just showed up, as if he somehow knew I needed him. He placed his hand on Paul's forehead and said with certainty, "You'll be fine, Hendrix. I'm here now." Later that evening, with Paul finally sleeping peacefully in the hospital bed, Holden and I sat together in the corridor. The fluorescent lights hummed above us. and the smell of antiseptic filled the air. I turned to him and asked, "Why are you doing all this?" He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes a genuine expression of warmth I'd rarely seen on his face. "Because I can't stay away from you anymore." His admission hung in the air between us. I tried to protest, "But we're from completely different worlds, Holden. I don't care." He interrupted firmly. "I don't care about the differences or what people might think. All I know is that when I'm with you and Paul, I feel like myself for the first time in years. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious?" I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "What are you saying?" He took my hand in his thumb tracing circles on my palm. "I'm saying that I'm falling for you, Hendrix. Maybe I already have. And I know this is complicated and messy and probably the most unprofessional thing I've ever done, but I can't pretend anymore. I can't go back to the way things were before." The vulnerability in his voice broke something open inside me. "I don't know how to do this. I admit alone for so long, focused only on taking care of Paul. I don't know how to let someone else in." Holden squeezed my hand gently. "Then we'll figure it out together, one day at a time. No pressure, no expectations. Just let me be part of your life. That's all I'm asking." We sat there for what felt like hours, hands intertwined, neither of us speaking. The hospital corridor was quiet except for the occasional footsteps of nurses making their rounds. Paul stirred in his sleep, and we both immediately turned to check on him. Watching Holden's concerned expression as he looked at my son, I realized something profound. This wasn't just attraction or infatuation. This was something deeper, something that had been building between us since that first midnight encounter. "When did this happen?" I asked softly. "When did you start feeling this way?" Holden thought for a moment before answering. "I think it was always there, underneath everything else. But I didn't recognize it until Paul sent that message. That simple text made me realize I'd been watching you for months, noticing little things, how you smile when you're concentrating, how patient you are with everyone, how your whole face lights up when you talk about Paul. I'd been drawn to you without even understanding why." His words wrapped around my heart. "I noticed you too," I confessed. "Not just as my boss, but as someone who seemed lonely despite being surrounded by people all the time. Someone who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders and never complained about it." We looked at each other then, really looked, and something unspoken passed between us, a promise, a beginning, an acknowledgement that whatever this was, it was real and worth exploring. As dawn began to break through the hospital windows, Paul woke up. His fever had broken and he looked so much better. When he saw Holden sitting beside me, his face broke into a weak smile. "Uncle Holden came to visit me?" he asked in his small voice. Holden moved closer to the bed and said, "Of course I did. I'll always be here when you need me." The way he said those words, the absolute conviction in his voice, made me realize that this wasn't temporary. Holden meant what he was saying. He was choosing us consciously and deliberately. And in that hospital room, with morning light streaming through the windows, something new began, something that would change all our lives forever. Paul recovered quickly after that night, and life seemed to settle into a new rhythm. But it wasn't the same rhythm as before. Everything had shifted. Holden started coming by more frequently. At first he'd make excuses about dropping off work documents or checking on Paul's health. But soon the pretenses fell away. He'd simply show up for dinner, or on weekends he'd take us to the park. Paul adored him, and watching them together did something to my heart I couldn't quite explain. One evening, while Paul was playing in his room, Holden and I sat on my small balcony. The city lights stretched out before us, and for a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what comes next for us." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" He turned to face me fully. "I mean that I can't keep living in two separate worlds. The professional one, where I pretend you're just another employee, and the personal one where I can barely think about anything except when I'll see you again." His honesty was both thrilling and terrifying. "What are you proposing?" I asked carefully. He reached for my hand. "I want to be open about this. About us. I know it's risky, especially given our work situation. But I'm tired of hiding how I feel. I'm tired of pretending that you don't mean everything to me." Before I could respond, my phone rang. It was my mother, calling for her weekly check-in. As I talked to her, I watched Holden interact with Paul, who had wandered out to show him a drawing. The ease between them, the natural affection, it made my heart ache with a longing I'd suppressed for years. When I ended the call, I found Holden looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Your mother doesn't know about me, does she?" he asked. I shook my head. "There's nothing to tell her yet. We haven't really defined what this is between us." He stood up and pulled me to my feet. "Then let me define it. I want to be with you, Hendrix. Properly. Not sneaking around. Not hiding. I want to take you and Paul out to dinner without worrying about who might see us. I want to be someone Paul can count on. Someone who's actually present in his life." The intensity in his voice made my breath catch. "You're really serious about this?" It wasn't a question. "More serious than I've been about anything in years," he confirmed. "But I need to know if you want the same thing. Because if we do this, it's going to get complicated. People will talk. The office dynamics will change. My family will have opinions, strong ones." I thought about what he was offering, what he was risking. Holden came from a world of country clubs and board meetings, of expectations and legacy. I was a single parent living paycheck to paycheck, trying to build a stable life for my son. The gulf between our circumstances was enormous, but when I looked into his eyes, all those practical concerns seemed to fade into the background. "I want this," I said quietly. "I want you. But I'm scared of what it might mean for Paul if things don't work out. He's already getting attached to you." Holden's expression softened. "I'm not going anywhere, Hendrix. I don't make promises I can't keep. When I commit to something or someone, I'm all in." The following week, Holden asked me to accompany him on a business trip. "I need your design input on a new project," he explained. But we both knew it was more than that. He wanted time with me, away from the office gossip and the careful distance we maintained during work hours. I was nervous about leaving Paul, but my neighbor, a kind elderly woman who adored my son, agreed to watch him. The trip was to Seattle, and from the moment we boarded the plane, everything felt different. Holden was more relaxed, more open. We talked about everything: his childhood growing up under his father's demanding expectations, my own journey as a young single parent, our dreams and fears. Over dinner at a restaurant overlooking the water, he said something that stayed with me. "I spent so many years trying to be the person everyone expected me to be that I forgot who I actually was. Being with you reminds me." That night, back at the hotel, he walked me to my room. We stood in the hallway, neither of us wanting to say goodnight. "Thank you for coming with me," he said. "Thank you for asking me," I replied. Then, before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in and kissed him. It was brief, tentative, but it felt like crossing a threshold we could never uncross. When we returned home, reality came crashing back. Whispers started circulating around the office. People noticed how Holden treated me differently, how he defended my work in meetings, how he often left the building at the same time. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. One afternoon, Holden's assistant, a stern woman named Margaret, cornered me in the break room. "You should be careful," she warned. "Holden comes from a very particular world. Whatever you think is happening between you two, it won't end well for someone like you." Her words stung, primarily because they echoed my own doubts. That evening, I talked to Holden about it. He was furious, not at me, but at the situation. "Margaret had no right to say that to you. I'll speak to her tomorrow." But I stopped him. "No, don't. She's not entirely wrong. Your family, your social circle, they're not going to accept this." "Accept us?" Holden pulled me close. "Let me worry about my family. All I need to know is whether you believe in what we have. Do you?" I looked up at him, at this powerful man who was choosing to be vulnerable with me. "Yes," I whispered. "I believe in us." He kissed my forehead gently. "Then that's all that matters." But the universe had other plans. A few days later, I received a call that made my blood run cold. It was from Holden's father's office, requesting a meeting. I knew this couldn't be good. When I arrived at the towering office building, I was ushered into a conference room where Holden's father, Richard Cross, sat waiting. He didn't waste time with pleasantry. "Mr. Hendrix, I understand you've become close with my son." His tone was neutral, but his eyes were cold. "Yes, sir," I replied, refusing to be intimidated. Richard leaned back in his chair. "I'm going to be direct with you. My son has responsibilities, a legacy to uphold. Whatever this is between you two, it's a distraction he can't afford. I'm prepared to offer you a substantial sum to quietly resign and remove yourself from Holden's life. The room seemed to spin. He was trying to buy me off, to erase me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. Anger surged through me. I'm not interested in your money, Mr. Cross, and I'm not going anywhere unless Holden asks me to. Richard's expression hardened. Then you leave me no choice. I'll make sure your life becomes very difficult. You have a son, don't you? Children need stability. Are you prepared to sacrifice his security for this relationship? The threat was clear. As I left that building, my hands were shaking. I hadn't told Holden about the meeting, and I didn't know if I should, but that night when he came over and saw my face, he knew something was wrong. What happened? He demanded. I told him everything. The fury in his eyes was unlike anything I'd ever seen. He did what? Holden grabbed his phone, but I stopped him. Don't. Not tonight. Let's just be together tonight. And so we sat on my couch, holding each other, both of us knowing that the fight for our relationship was just beginning. The days following Richard Cross's threat were some of the hardest I'd ever experienced. I went to work with a knot in my stomach, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Holden noticed my tension immediately. You're not telling me something, he said one evening as we sat in his car outside my apartment. Paul was upstairs with the babysitter, giving us a rare moment of privacy. I'd been debating whether to burden him with his father's ultimatum, but the weight of it was crushing me. Your father called me to his office last week, I finally admitted. Holden's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He did what? I explained everything. The offer of money, the thinly veiled threats about Paul's security, the demand that I disappear from his life. With each word I watched Holden's expression transform from concern to fury. That manipulative bastard. He breathed. He had no right. But I placed my hand on his arm. He's your father, Holden. He thinks he's protecting you, protecting the family legacy. Holden turned to face me fully, his eyes blazing. I don't need protection from you. You're the best thing that's happened to me in years. He can't see that because he's so focused on appearances and bloodlines and maintaining some ridiculous dynasty. The passion in his voice should have reassured me, but instead it terrified me. What if he's right, though? What if I'm just a distraction that's going to derail everything you've worked for? Holden cupped my face in his hands. Listen to me carefully, Hendrix. You are not a distraction. You're the reason I remember why any of this matters. Before you, I was just going through the motions, building an empire I didn't even want. Now I actually have something worth fighting for. His words broke through my defenses, and I kissed him deeply, desperately, trying to convey everything I couldn't say. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing hard. What do we do now? I whispered. Holden's jaw set with determination. We live our lives. We don't let him dictate our choices. And we prepare for whatever he throws at us next. Over the following weeks, things began to shift in unexpected ways. Holden started bringing Paul to the office on weekends, when I had to catch up on projects. At first, I worried about the optics, but Holden dismissed my concerns. This is who I am now, he said simply. Someone who cares about you and your son. If people can't handle that, they can find employment elsewhere. Watching him interact with Paul was transformative. He wasn't just tolerating my son's presence. He was genuinely engaged. They'd build elaborate structures with office supplies, or Holden would explain complicated business concepts in ways that made Paul giggle. One afternoon I found them in the conference room, Paul sitting in Holden's lap while they looked at architectural designs together. Uncle Holden says I could be an architect someday, Paul announced proudly. The pure joy on Holden's face made my heart ache, but the professional environment was becoming increasingly hostile. Colleagues who'd once been friendly now avoided me in the halls. I overheard whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms. Margaret, Holden's assistant, had become particularly cold, barely acknowledging my presence. The isolation was wearing on me, making me question whether this relationship was worth the cost. One particularly difficult day, I was called into a meeting with the design team. They tore apart my latest project proposal, not with constructive criticism, but with barely concealed contempt. This is beneath our standards, one senior designer declared. Maybe you should focus more on your work and less on other office activities. The implication was clear. I sat there, humiliated, unable to defend myself without making things worse. I didn't tell Holden about the meeting, but he found out anyway. The next morning, he called an emergency department gathering. "I've noticed some concerning behavior recently," he began, his tone ice cold. "Unprofessional conduct, targeted harassment, creating a hostile work environment. Let me be extremely clear. This company was built on merit and innovation, not gossip and discrimination. Anyone uncomfortable with that is welcome to submit their resignation." The room fell silent. Several people wouldn't meet his eye. After the meeting, I confronted him in his office. "You can't keep fighting my battles for me. It only makes things worse." But Holden was unapologetic. "I'm not fighting your battles. I'm maintaining professional standards in my company. What they're doing to you is unacceptable, regardless of our personal relationship." He paused, then added more softly, "Besides, protecting the people I love isn't negotiable." The people he loved. He'd never used those words before. They hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. "Holden," I started, but he shook his head. "You don't have to say it back. I just needed you to know where I stand." But I did want to say it back. I wanted to tell him that I loved him too, that he'd become essential to my life, that imagining a future without him was impossible. The words stuck in my throat, tangled up with fear and doubt. That evening, Holden came home with us. It was becoming more common now. This casual domesticity. While I cooked dinner, he helped Paul with a school project about families. I overheard Paul asking, "Uncle Holden, do you have a family?" There was a long pause. "I'm building one," Holden finally answered. "With people who matter to me." Paul seemed satisfied with this answer, but it left me emotional, blinking back tears over the stove. After Paul went to bed, Holden and I sat together on the couch. He pulled out his phone and showed me something. A listing for a house. It was beautiful with large windows and a sprawling backyard. "What is this?" I asked. "A possibility," he said carefully. "A place where we could all live together, where Paul could have his own room, a yard to play in, where you wouldn't have to worry about rent or bills." My breath caught. "Holden, I can't let you buy me a house. It wouldn't be for you," he clarified. "It would be for us. All three of us." The implication was staggering. He wasn't just talking about dating or a casual relationship. He was envisioning a future, a life built together. "That's a huge step," I managed to say. "I know," he agreed, "and I'm not saying we need to do it tomorrow. But I wanted you to know that I'm thinking long term. This isn't temporary for me, Hendrix. You and Paul, you're my endgame." His certainty should have been comforting, but instead it amplified my fears. What if his father escalated his threats? What if the professional backlash became unbearable? What if I couldn't give Holden the kind of life he deserved? "I'm scared," I admitted quietly. "I'm terrified of letting you sacrifice everything for us and then somehow failing you." Holden pulled me against his chest. "The only way you could fail me is by not letting me try. Let me be here. Let me be part of this. That's all I'm asking." We stayed like that for a long time, wrapped up in each other, neither of us speaking. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, but in my small apartment, the world felt reduced to just the two of us. Eventually, Holden whispered against my hair, "I know you're not ready to say it yet, but I need you to know something. I love you, Hendrix. Not despite the complications, but including them. All of it, you, Paul. This messy, beautiful life we're building. I love all of it." And this time I found my voice. "I love you too," I whispered back. "I have for a while now. I was just too afraid to admit it." His arms tightened around me and I felt him exhale deeply, as if he'd been holding his breath waiting for those words. The next few months felt like living in a beautiful dream that could shatter at any moment. Holden and I fell into a rhythm, work during the day, maintaining appropriate professional boundaries, then evenings together as a makeshift family. Paul started calling him Uncle Holden with increasing frequency, and every time I heard it, my heart swelled and broke simultaneously. This couldn't last forever. Something would have to give. The breaking point came during the annual company gala. It was the biggest event of the year, where clients, board members, and industry leaders gathered. Holden had asked me to attend as his date, not as an employee, but as his partner. Are you sure about this? I'd asked when he extended the invitation. This is making a public statement. He'd simply smiled. That's exactly what I'm doing. Making a statement. The evening started beautifully. Holden looked devastating in his tuxedo, and the way he looked at me when I emerged in my rented suit made me feel like the only person in the room. We arrived together, his hand resting possessively on my lower back as we entered the venue. Heads turned. Whispers started immediately, but Holden seemed completely unbothered, introducing me to everyone as his partner, not his employee. Richard Cross arrived an hour into the event. I saw him across the room, his expression darkening when he spotted us together. He made his way over with deliberate purpose. "Holden, we need to talk," he said without preamble, completely ignoring my presence. "Later, father," Holden replied coolly. "I'm with Hendrix right now." Richard's jaw tightened. "Now. It's urgent." The tension was suffocating. I touched Holden's arm. "It's fine. Go ahead. I'll get us drinks." I watched them disappear into a private room, anxiety churning in my stomach. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. When Holden finally emerged, his face was pale, his expression shattered. He found me immediately and said, "We need to leave. Right now." We drove in silence to his penthouse. I'd never been there before, but this wasn't the time to comment on it. Once inside, Holden poured himself a drink with shaking hands. "He's calling in favors," Holden finally said, threatening to tank my position at the company. "He's got enough board support to force me out." My stomach dropped. Because of me. It wasn't a question. Holden downed his drink. "Because he's a controlling tyrant who can't accept that I want a life outside his carefully constructed plans." He poured another glass, then another. I'd never seen him like this. So defeated, so broken. "There has to be another way," I said desperately. "Maybe if I stepped back, gave him what he wants." "No." The word was sharp, final. "That's exactly what he wants. He thinks if he applies enough pressure, I'll choose the company over you. That I'll fall in line like I always have." He turned to face me and there were tears in his eyes. "But I can't, Hendrix. I can't lose you. Not even for an empire." We spent that night talking through every possible scenario. Holden could fight his father, but it would be ugly and protracted, potentially destroying the company in the process. He could comply, taking over as expected but ending our relationship, a thought that made both of us physically ill. Or he could walk away entirely, leaving behind everything he'd built. "What do you want?" I finally asked as dawn broke over the city skyline. Holden was quiet for a long moment. "I want a life where I make my own choices, where I'm valued for who I am, not just the name I carry. I want to build something that's actually mine, not just inherit someone else's vision." He looked at me with such intensity it hurt. "And I want you and Paul in that life. Those are my non-negotiables." Over the next few weeks, I watched Holden systematically dismantle his connection to Cross Industries. He met with lawyers, separated his personal assets from family holdings, began planning an exit strategy. His father tried everything. Threats, bribes, guilt. But Holden remained resolute. "I'm done living someone else's life," he told Richard during their final confrontation. "You can keep your company. I'll build my own." The day Holden officially resigned was surreal. He cleaned out his office with remarkable calm, boxing up years of work. Colleagues who'd once deferred to him now avoided eye contact. Margaret actually cried, apologizing for her treatment of me. "I thought I was protecting him," she said. "I didn't realize I was just enabling his father's control." It was a small moment of grace in an otherwise painful process. That night, Holden showed up at my apartment soaking wet. It had started raining during his drive over, but he was smiling, genuinely smiling, in a way I'd never seen before. "I did it," he said. "I'm free." We stood in my doorway, rain dripping onto my floor, and I pulled him inside. "What happens now?" I asked. He kissed me, deep and passionate and full of promise. "Now we build something new, together." The following months were the hardest financially. Holden was starting from scratch with his consulting firm and I was job hunting after quietly leaving Cross Industries. Money was tight. There were nights when I worried about making rent, about providing for Paul, but there was also something liberating about it. We were choosing this life, these struggles. They were ours. Holden proved surprisingly adaptable to a more modest lifestyle. He moved out of his penthouse into a smaller apartment closer to us. He learned to cook basic meals. He helped Paul with homework at my kitchen table. One evening, I found him attempting to fix a leaky faucet, cursing colorfully when water sprayed everywhere. "I never learned this stuff," he admitted sheepishly. "Always had people for it." But he was trying, really trying, to build a normal life. His new business began gaining traction. Clients who respected his work ethic rather than his family name started hiring him. It was slower growth than he'd been accustomed to, but it was sustainable, and more importantly, it was his. I watched him transform from a man weighted down by expectations into someone who actually enjoyed his work. "I forgot what this felt like," he said one day. "Being excited about a project. Creating something I'm actually proud of." 6 months after leaving Cross Industries, Holden took Paul and me on a trip. Nothing extravagant, just a weekend camping upstate. Watching him attempt to set up a tent while Paul helped by getting tangled in the ropes was comedy gold. That night, sitting around a campfire, Paul asked, "Uncle Holden, are you going to stay with us forever?" Holden glanced at me, then back at Paul. "If your papa will let me, I'd like that very much." Later, after Paul had fallen asleep in the tent, Holden and I stayed by the dying fire. "I have something to tell you," he said nervously. "I've been looking at houses. Nothing fancy, but something with a yard for Paul. Room for all of us." My heart started racing. "Holden, I know we haven't talked about this explicitly," he continued quickly, "but I want this to be permanent. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to be there when Paul learns to ride a bike. I want all the mundane, beautiful, ordinary moments that make a life." Tears streamed down my face. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" He took both my hands in his. "Move in with me. Let's make this official. Let's be a family, not just in private but in every way that matters." I couldn't speak, so I just nodded, pulling him into a kiss that tasted like smoke and tears and hope. A year later, my life was unrecognizable in the best possible way. Holden's firm had grown steadily, now occupying a small office space with 3 employees. I'd started freelancing, which gave me flexibility to be present for Paul while still contributing financially. We'd found a house modest but perfect, with a backyard where Paul could play and a kitchen big enough for family dinners. It wasn't the life Holden had been groomed for, but it was the life he'd chosen, the life we'd built together. Today was special for multiple reasons. It was my birthday again, exactly 1 year since that midnight visit that had changed everything. But it was also the day Holden had been planning something, though he refused to tell me what. I woke to the smell of pancakes and the sound of giggling from downstairs. When I descended, I found Paul and Holden in the kitchen, both wearing matching aprons, flour dusted across their faces. "Happy birthday, Papa," Paul shrieked, launching himself at me. Holden smiled, that soft smile reserved only for us. We made breakfast. Well, Paul supervised while I tried not to burn the house down. The pancakes were slightly lopsided and the bacon a bit crispy, but it was the most perfect meal I'd ever had. We ate together at our kitchen table, the one Holden had assembled himself, slightly crooked but sturdy, and I felt overwhelmingly grateful for this simple, beautiful life. After breakfast, Holden suggested we spend the day at the beach. It was October, too cold for swimming, but Paul loved collecting shells. We drove out to the coast, Paul chattering the entire way about a science project he was working on. Holden listened with genuine interest, asking questions that made Paul puff up with pride. Watching them interact still gave me this warm, tight feeling in my chest. Love mixed with disbelief that this was actually my reality. At the beach, Paul ran ahead, searching for treasures in the sand. Holden and I walked slowly behind, hands intertwined. "Can you believe it's been a year?" I asked. He squeezed my hand. "Best year of my life, even with all the chaos," and it had been chaotic. Adjusting to living together, navigating Paul's questions about what exactly Holden was to us, dealing with occasional judgment from strangers who saw 2 men raising a child. But it had also been filled with so much joy. "I have something for you," Holden said suddenly, stopping near where the waves crashed against the shore. He pulled out a small envelope from his jacket pocket. "Open it." Inside was a legal document. I scanned it, my vision blurring as I understood what I was reading. Adoption papers, papers that would make Holden legally Paul's second parent. I've been working with a lawyer for months, he explained. If you're comfortable with it, if you think Paul would want this, I'd like to officially adopt him. Make this permanent in every possible way. I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat. This wasn't just about us anymore. This was about Paul, about giving him the security and love he deserved. We should ask him, I finally managed. Holden nodded. That's why I wanted to do this today. So we could all talk about it together. We called Paul over and Holden knelt in the sand to be at his eye level. Hey buddy, I want to ask you something important. How would you feel if I became your dad officially? If we were a real family in every way? Paul's eyes went wide. Like you'd be my dad? Not just Uncle Holden? Holden's voice was thick with emotion. Exactly like that. If you want me to be. Paul threw his arms around Holden's neck. Yes, I want that. Can I call you Dad now? Holden hugged him tightly, and I saw tears streaming down his face. You can call me whatever you want, as long as you know I love you. Paul pulled back, suddenly serious. I love you too, Dad. And just like that, our family became complete. We stayed at the beach until sunset, Paul racing along the shore while Holden and I talked about next steps, the adoption process, how to explain it to Paul's school, when to start calling ourselves what we actually were, a family. As the sky turned pink and orange, Holden led me away from where Paul was playing. There's one more thing, he said, and I noticed he was trembling slightly. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My heart stopped. Hendrix, this past year has been the most challenging and most rewarding of my entire life. You've taught me what actually matters. You've shown me that love doesn't have to come with conditions or expectations. And Paul, his voice broke slightly, Paul has given me the greatest gift I could ever receive. The chance to be a father. He opened the box, revealing 2 simple silver bands. I know we can't legally marry everywhere. I know there will be people who don't understand or accept us. But I want to commit to you in every way I can. I want to stand in front of our friends and family and promise to be yours for the rest of my life. He was crying openly now. Will you marry me, Hendrix? Will you let me be your husband and Paul's father? Will you keep choosing this life we've built together? I was sobbing too hard to speak clearly, but I managed to choke out, yes, yes, to everything, always yes. He slipped the ring onto my finger and I did the same for him. Then we were kissing, the ocean roaring behind us, the sky painted in impossible colors, and Paul's delighted whoops as he realized what was happening. He ran over and crashed into us, wrapping his small arms around both our legs. We're really a family now, he declared. That evening, back at home, we called a few close friends to share the news. My neighbor who'd watched Paul that first night, Holden's former assistant Margaret, who'd become an unexpected ally, a few colleagues from both our current jobs. The response was overwhelmingly positive. We were building a support system, a community that accepted and celebrated us. It wasn't perfect, and there were still people from our pasts who couldn't understand our choices, but we had enough love surrounding us to weather any storm. Later, after Paul had finally crashed from the excitement and was tucked safely in bed, Holden and I stood on our back porch. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, and we looked up at the stars. Thank you, he whispered against my neck, for taking a chance on me that night, for believing we could make this work. I turned in his arms. Thank you for showing up with a cake and a trembling voice, for being brave enough to choose love over obligation. We stood there in comfortable silence, and I thought about how a single text message from a 4-year-old had led to this moment. Paul's innocent request had unlocked something neither Holden nor I knew we needed. Permission to choose happiness over expectation, love over duty, authenticity over performance. Our story wasn't conventional, and it hadn't been easy, but it was ours. Real and messy and absolutely perfect. As we headed inside, Holden's hand found mine naturally, our rings catching the porch light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, there always would be, but we'd face them together, the 3 of us, a family forged not by obligation but by choice. And that made all the difference.